The look on Ted Cruz's face when he realized what just happened will haunt him forever. Picture this, the ornate Senate hearing room, marble columns stretching toward vaulted ceilings like ancient pillars of justice. Every seat in the gallery packed with reporters, lobbyists, and citizens who somehow sensed they were about to witness history. C-SPAN cameras humming quietly, streaming live to millions of Americans grabbing popcorn for what they thought would be another boring committee hearing. Ted Cruz sat smugly behind his nameplate, that familiar smirk playing across his lips. He'd just finished a 5-minute grandstanding speech about government overreach and job-killing regulations, his voice dripping with the kind of folksy Texas charm that had carried him through countless political theater performances. The corporate talking points rolled off his tongue like a rehearsed prayer. He leaned back in his leather chair, confident he'd just delivered a crushing blow to the progressive agenda. But Elizabeth Warren sat motionless across the curved mahogany table, her gray hair pulled back in that no-nonsense style, wire-rimmed glasses catching the overhead lights. She hadn't interrupted once. Hadn't even looked up from the thick manila folder spread open before her. Her pen moved steadily across a yellow legal pad, like a prosecutor taking notes on a confession. The silence stretched just long enough to make Cruz shift uncomfortably. Then Warren looked up, her piercing blue eyes locking onto his with the intensity of a laser-guided missile. When she spoke, her voice was calm, measured, deadly quiet, the kind of tone that makes experienced politicians break into cold sweats. Senator Cruz, you just told this committee that corporate regulations destroy American jobs. That's interesting, because according to your own voting record, you've taken over $2.7 million from the very corporations you're now claiming to regulate. She paused, letting that number hang in the air like a death sentence. Would you like to explain to the American people how that works? The color drained from Cruz's face faster than water from a broken dam. His mouth opened, then closed, then opened again like a fish gasping for air. The confident smirk vanished, replaced by the wide-eyed panic of a man who just realized he'd walked into a trap he'd set for himself. The packed gallery leaned forward as one. Even the seasoned political reporters stopped typing, sensing they were witnessing something extraordinary. In that electric moment, everyone in America watching knew they were about to see Ted Cruz get absolutely dismantled by someone who had done her homework. But what Warren did next didn't just embarrass Cruz, it exposed a truth so damaging that corporate lobbyists immediately went into crisis mode. This wasn't just another political theater performance or cable news soundbite moment. What was unfolding in that hearing room would determine whether American families drowning in corporate greed would finally get a lifeline, or whether the most powerful industries in the country would continue writing their own rules while ordinary people paid the price. The specific battle at hand? A proposed regulation that would force big banks to actually verify mortgage applications instead of rubber-stamping loans they knew would fail. It sounds boring, technical, bureaucratic. But behind that dry language lived the difference between families keeping their homes and families sleeping in their cars. Between communities thriving and neighborhoods turning into ghost towns dotted with foreclosure signs. Warren knew the numbers by heart because she'd lived them, breathed them, fought them for decades. Over 12 million American families had lost their homes in the last financial crisis. 12 million. Not statistics on a spreadsheet, but real people. The single mother in Detroit who lost her house when predatory lenders convinced her to refinance at rates designed to fail. The retired veteran in Phoenix whose VA benefits couldn't save him from a mortgage scam. The immigrant family in Miami who worked 3 jobs each and still couldn't escape the trap of a loan they never should have qualified for. Meanwhile, the banks that created this catastrophe? They walked away with over $400 billion in taxpayer bailouts. $400 billion. That's enough money to house every homeless person in America for 20 years. Instead, it went to executive bonuses while families packed their belongings into storage units they couldn't afford. And here sat Ted Cruz, defender of the little guy, arguing that requiring banks to verify someone's income before handing them a mortgage was somehow an assault on American freedom. The same Ted Cruz whose campaign coffers overflowed with donations from Wells Fargo, J.P. Morgan Chase, and Goldman Sachs, the very institutions that had turned mortgage fraud into an art form. This was the moment that would define whether American democracy still belonged to the people, or whether it had been permanently sold to the highest bidder. Every person watching understood the stakes, even if they couldn't articulate them. They felt it in their student loan payments that never seemed to shrink the principal. They saw it in their credit card statements with interest rates that would make loan sharks blush. They lived it every time they chose between prescription medications and groceries. Warren represented something Cruz couldn't buy, couldn't spin, couldn't perform his way around. She represented expertise earned through actual suffering, knowledge gained by studying real families destroyed by corporate greed. She'd spent decades in bankruptcy courts watching the American dream die one foreclosure at a time, while Cruz had spent decades in corporate boardrooms figuring out how to kill it faster. The gallery knew they were witnessing a reckoning. Progressive activists who'd driven hours to attend gripped their seats. Corporate lobbyists frantically typed messages on their phones, trying to figure out damage control for a disaster that was just beginning. Even the C-SPAN cameras seemed to focus more intently, as if the operators sensed they were documenting a historic moment. This was bigger than Warren versus Cruz. This was the moment when someone with actual knowledge would finally confront someone whose entire career was built on empty performance. When preparation would meet propaganda. When the voice of working families would face down the puppet of corporate America. But what Warren did next didn't just expose Cruz's hypocrisy, it revealed how deeply the corruption had infected American democracy, and why Ted Cruz was about to become the poster child for everything wrong with our political system. Ted Cruz wasn't born a corporate puppet. That transformation took years of careful cultivation, like a rare orchid that only blooms in the toxic soil of Washington corruption. Once upon a time, Rafael Edward Cruz was the golden boy of conservative intellectualism. Princeton University debate champion, where he honed the theatrical flair that would later make him a master of political performance. Harvard Law Review, where his professors praised his razor-sharp constitutional analysis. Supreme Court clerk under Chief Justice William Rehnquist, where he helped craft legal arguments that would reshape American jurisprudence. Back then, Cruz genuinely believed he was destined to defend the Constitution against government overreach. His early writing sparkled with principled conservative philosophy, limited government, individual liberty, checks and balances. He spoke passionately about protecting ordinary Americans from the twin tyrannies of big government and big corporations. Young Ted Cruz would have been disgusted by what he eventually became. But somewhere between his Supreme Court clerkship and his Senate campaign, Cruz discovered something intoxicating. Corporate money didn't just fund campaigns, it transformed ambitious politicians into untouchable aristocrats. The realization hit him like a religious conversion. Why fight for principles when you could perform for profit? The seduction began subtly. A few thousand here from energy companies who appreciated his free market rhetoric. A speaking fee there from financial firms who loved his attacks on job-killing regulations. Before long, Cruz had built a fundraising machine that would make a Wall Street banker weep with envy. Goldman Sachs alone had pumped over $1 million into his political career, the same Goldman Sachs that had helped trigger the 2008 financial crisis while betting against the very mortgage securities they were selling to pension funds. Wells Fargo, caught red-handed creating millions of fake accounts to steal from customers, contributed another $800,000. J.P. Morgan Chase, which paid billions in fines for manipulating energy markets, kicked in $600,000 more. But Cruz's corruption wasn't just about money, it was about intellectual dishonesty on an epic scale. The man who once wrote brilliant constitutional analysis now recycled corporate talking points with all the originality of a broken photocopier. His voting record read like a wish list from the Chamber of Commerce, against consumer protection, against financial oversight, against literally every regulation that might cut into corporate profits by even a fraction of a percentage point. The pattern was always the same. Corporate lobbyists would draft legislation, Cruz would sponsor it with some folksy name like the American Jobs Protection Act, then he'd perform outrage when anyone questioned whether letting banks police themselves was really in America's best interest. Maximum theater, minimum substance, zero shame. His grandstanding had become legendary in the worst possible way. Remember his 21-hour fake filibuster where he read "Green Eggs and Ham" while government workers faced furloughs? Pure performance art designed to generate headlines and fundraising emails, with no actual policy goals beyond self-promotion. Or his dramatic flight to Cancun while his Texas constituents froze without power during the winter storm. Even his crisis management was performative, throwing his own daughters under the bus to explain why he'd abandoned his state during its darkest hour. The most infuriating part wasn't CRUZ'S corruption. Washington was full of corrupt politicians. It was his arrogance, his absolute certainty that his Ivy League credentials and debate team tricks made him untouchable. He'd perfected the art of sounding smart while saying nothing, of appearing principled while serving only his donors' interests. CRUZ genuinely believed he was the smartest person in any room, that his Princeton-Harvard Supreme Court pedigree gave him intellectual superiority over everyone else. He treated Senate hearings like high school debate competitions where style points mattered more than substance, where a clever turn of phrase could substitute for actual knowledge. But his arrogance had blinded him to a crucial fact: there were people in Washington who'd done more than just read about economic policy in law school textbooks. There were people who'd lived in the wreckage that corporate greed created, who'd studied the human cost of the very policies CRUZ championed for his donors. Elizabeth Warren was one of those people. And unlike CRUZ, she hadn't spent decades performing expertise, she'd spent decades earning it in bankruptcy courts, academic research, and real-world battles against the financial industry. She knew where all the bodies were buried because she'd helped dig the graves. CRUZ thought he was walking into another performance opportunity, another chance to dazzle the cameras with his constitutional scholarship and folksy charm. He had no idea he was about to face someone who'd forgotten more about banking regulation than he'd ever bothered to learn. The hunter was about to become the hunted, and Ted Cruz was completely unprepared for what was coming next. Elizabeth Warren never wanted to be a politician. She wanted to be a teacher, just like her mother had dreamed of being before the Great Depression crushed those hopes along with millions of others. But sometimes the universe has different plans, and sometimes those plans involve watching corporate predators destroy American families until you can't stay silent anymore. Warren's journey began in the wreckage of the American dream. As a young bankruptcy lawyer in the 1970s, she thought she knew what financial collapse looked like: irresponsible people making bad choices, living beyond their means, facing the inevitable consequences. The academic theory was clean, simple, morally satisfying. Reality was messier, more heartbreaking, and infinitely more complex. Her first case shattered every assumption she'd ever held. A middle-aged waitress from Oklahoma, working double shifts to support her disabled husband, had been talked into a predatory loan by a bank that knew she could never make the payments. The woman sat across from Warren's desk, tears streaming down her weathered face, holding a foreclosure notice in hands that shook from exhaustion and shame. She'd worked her entire life, never missed a day, never asked for help, and now she was losing everything because a corporation had targeted her desperation for profit. That's when Warren realized the textbooks had gotten it backwards. Most families filing for bankruptcy weren't irresponsible spendthrifts, they were hardworking Americans crushed by medical bills, job losses, or corporate scams designed to extract wealth from the middle class. The real irresponsibility belonged to the institutions that created these traps, then blamed their victims for falling into them. She began studying bankruptcy cases like a detective investigating a crime spree, because that's essentially what it was. Pattern after pattern emerged: predatory lending, medical bankruptcies, credit card companies targeting college students and seniors, mortgage brokers steering families toward loans guaranteed to fail. Every case told the same story: corporate predators had turned the American dream into a hunting ground. Warren's working-class roots made these stories hit differently than they might have for other academics. She'd grown up in Oklahoma during the oil bust, watching her own family teeter on the edge of financial collapse when her father had a heart attack. She remembered her mother pulling her best dress out of the closet and walking into Sears to beg for a minimum-wage job at 50 years old, just to keep the family house. That desperation, that fear, that grinding uncertainty, she recognized it in every client who walked through her door. But recognition wasn't enough. Warren began documenting the destruction with academic precision, publishing study after study that revealed how corporate America had systematically dismantled the financial security that previous generations had taken for granted. Her research became a devastating indictment of deregulation, showing how every protective law that got repealed made life harder for working families and easier for Wall Street predators. The academic world noticed. Harvard offered her a professorship, recognizing her groundbreaking work on family bankruptcy. She could have spent her career safely ensconced in ivory tower comfort, writing papers that 12 other professors would read. Instead, she kept digging deeper into the wreckage, kept documenting the human cost of corporate greed, kept fighting for families who had no other champion. Her methodology became legendary among her colleagues and terrifying to corporate lawyers. Warren didn't just read legislation, she traced every clause back to its origin, identified which lobbyist had written which provision, calculated the exact cost to consumers down to the penny. She could quote bankruptcy statistics from memory, cite specific case law without notes, and explain complex financial instruments in language a truck driver could understand. When the 2008 financial crisis hit, Warren watched in horror as millions of families lost everything while the banks that caused the disaster collected taxpayer bailouts. That's when her academic outrage transformed into political action. She began appearing on television, testifying before Congress, demanding accountability from an industry that had turned fraud into a business model. The idea for a Consumer Financial Protection Bureau emerged from Warren's decades of research and her fundamental understanding that individual consumers couldn't possibly match the resources and expertise of multinational corporations. Families needed an advocate, a watchdog, someone with the power to fight back against predatory practices. Wall Street mobilized against her like she was an invading army. Banking lobbyists spent millions trying to kill the CFPB before it could be born. They attacked Warren personally, professionally, politically, anything to stop someone who actually understood their business model from gaining power to regulate it. The fact that they fought so hard only proved how necessary her work had become. But every attack only strengthened Warren's resolve. She'd seen too many families destroyed, too many dreams crushed, too many communities hollowed out by corporate greed. She'd spent decades preparing for this moment, building an encyclopedic knowledge of financial regulation that no amount of corporate money could match or buy. Her preparation was methodical, obsessive, complete. She read every study, memorized every statistic, understood every loophole. She knew which senators had taken money from which banks, which votes had been bought with which donations, which policies had caused which disasters. Her legal pads filled with notes that would make corporate executives break into cold sweats if they ever saw them. This extensive preparation and real-world expertise was about to collide with CRUZ'S empty rhetoric like a freight train hitting a house of cards. CRUZ opened with his greatest hits, that familiar blend of constitutional theory and folksy charm that had carried him through countless political performances. He adjusted his tie, flashed that practiced smile toward the C-SPAN cameras, and launched into what sounded like a prepared speech he'd given 100 times before. Madam Chair, I want to thank you for holding this important hearing on the fundamental question facing our great nation today, he began, his voice carrying that slight Texas drawl that focus groups had probably told him made him seem more authentic. Are we going to trust the American people to make their own financial decisions, or are we going to let big government bureaucrats in Washington dictate how hard-working families manage their own money? The gallery stirred slightly. Here we go, their collective body language seemed to say. Another Ted Cruz show. Cruz warmed to his theme, gesturing broadly with the kind of theatrical flair that had served him well on the Princeton debate team. The legislation we're discussing today represents nothing less than an assault on American freedom. These so-called consumer protections are really job-killing regulations that will make it harder for families to get mortgages, harder for small businesses to access credit, harder for the American dream to flourish in communities across this great country. He paused for effect, letting his eyes sweep the gallery like a preacher surveying his congregation. Several corporate lobbyists in expensive suits nodded approvingly from the back rows. This was going exactly as they'd hoped. Now, I know my colleague Senator Warren means well, Cruz continued, his tone taking on that condescending quality that made progressives want to throw things at their television screens. But the road to economic hell is paved with good intentions and government regulations. Every time Washington tries to help working families, we end up hurting the very people we claim to protect. CRUZ'S voice grew louder, his gestures more dramatic. He was hitting his stride now, feeding off the energy of friendly faces in the audience, confident in his ability to frame this debate on his terms. He talked about constitutional principles and free market solutions, with the kind of abstract eloquence that sounded impressive if you didn't think too hard about what he was actually saying. But Warren sat motionless across from him, her gray head bent slightly over that thick manila folder, her pen moving steadily across her notepad. She wasn't performing for the cameras or playing to the gallery. She was hunting. The American people don't need more bureaucrats telling them what's best for their families, CRUZ declared, his voice rising to what he clearly thought was an inspiring crescendo. They need more freedom, more opportunity, more trust in their own judgment. They need government to get out of the way and let capitalism work its magic. The Republican senators flanking CRUZ nodded along appreciatively. The corporate lobbyists smiled. Even some of the reporters seemed to be buying into his performance. CRUZ was doing what CRUZ did best, making terrible policies sound like patriotic principles, turning corporate welfare into populist rhetoric. As he spoke, CRUZ grew more animated, more confident. His hands moved through the air like a conductor directing an orchestra of corporate talking points. He quoted the Constitution, referenced the Founding Fathers, painted himself as a champion of ordinary Americans against the Washington elite. It was a masterclass in political theater, complete with dramatic pauses and carefully calibrated emotional beats. He thought he was winning. Hell, maybe he was winning. The friendly faces in the audience certainly thought so. The banking lobbyists looked relieved. Even some of the neutral observers seemed impressed by his passionate defense of American values. But something electric was building in that marble-columned room. The progressive activists in the gallery sat perfectly still, their eyes fixed not on CRUZ's performance but on Warren's methodical note-taking. The experienced political reporters had stopped typing their usual play-by-play coverage, sensing that something significant was about to happen. Warren's pen never stopped moving. Every statistic CRUZ misrepresented, every talking point he recycled, every corporate donation he failed to mention, she was documenting it all with the precision of a prosecutor building a case. The silence that followed CRUZ's final flourish would become legendary. Warren looked up slowly from her notes, her steel-blue eyes meeting CRUZ's across the polished mahogany table. The pause stretched just long enough to make the entire room hold its breath. She reached for that thick manila folder with the deliberate precision of a surgeon selecting the perfect scalpel. "Thank you for that, passionate defense of corporate interests, Senator CRUZ," she began, her voice carrying the kind of quiet intensity that made experienced politicians break into cold sweats. "I'd like to respond with some facts." CRUZ's confident smile flickered slightly, but he maintained his theatrical posture, one eyebrow raised in that practiced expression of amused skepticism. He had no idea what was coming. Warren opened the folder with theatrical precision, revealing page after page of documents, charts, and highlighted text. The gallery leaned forward as one, sensing they were about to witness something extraordinary. Even the other senators stopped their whispered side conversations, their attention drawn by the electric tension crackling through the room. "You just told this committee that government regulations hurt working families," Warren continued, her tone remaining perfectly calm while CRUZ's smile began to fade around the edges. "But according to your own voting record, which I have right here, you've consistently voted against every consumer protection measure that's come before this body." "Not some of them. All of them." She pulled out the first document, holding it up for the cameras to see. "Senate Bill 2155, the Economic Growth Act. You voted to roll back protections that prevented banks from making the same risky loans that caused the 2008 crisis. Your own statement at the time called these protections unnecessary government interference. That was March 14, 2018. CRUZ shifted slightly in his chair, his theatrical confidence beginning to evaporate like morning dew. The gallery was completely silent now, every phone in the room quietly recording what felt like a historic moment. But here's what's interesting, Senator, Warren continued, pulling out another document. 3 weeks before that vote, you received a campaign contribution of $50,000 from the American Bankers Association. 2 weeks after your vote, you received another $25,000 from Wells Fargo's PAC. Would you call that a coincidence? The color was starting to drain from Cruz's face, but Warren was just getting started. She pulled out another page, this one covered in yellow highlighter. You mentioned the American dream, Senator. Let me tell you about Maria Gonzalez from Houston, that's in your state, Texas. She lost her home in 2019 because of a predatory loan that would have been illegal under the regulations you helped eliminate. She wrote to your office 14 times asking for help. Your staff sent her a form letter about free market principles. Social media was starting to buzz. Phones throughout the gallery lit up with notifications as clips of Warren's methodical destruction began circulating on Twitter. Hashtag Warren vs. Cruz was already trending. But Warren wasn't done. She pulled out a thick printout that looked like a voting record analysis. Since 2013, you have taken over $2.7 million from the financial services industry. During that same period, you voted against consumer protections 47 times out of 47 opportunities. That's a perfect batting average, Senator. Your Wall Street donors must be very proud. Cruz finally found his voice, though it came out as more of a croak than his usual booming rhetoric. Senator Warren, I resent the implication. Oh, I'm not implying anything, Warren cut him off with the kind of precision that made corporate lawyers wake up screaming. I'm stating facts. Would you like me to continue? She didn't wait for an answer. The next document was a transcript, and when Warren began reading from it, her voice took on the cadence of someone delivering a eulogy for Cruz's political credibility. This is from your own speech to the Texas Bankers Association last year. And I quote, "Government regulation is the enemy of innovation, the enemy of opportunity, the enemy of the American dream." You received a standing ovation for that speech, Senator. You also received a check for $75,000 for giving it. The gallery was now completely transfixed. This wasn't just political theater, this was a methodical dismantling of a sitting senator by someone who had done her homework so thoroughly that escape was impossible. Other senators were staring at Warren with a mixture of awe and terror, realizing they were witnessing a masterclass in political preparation. Warren pulled out her final document, and the way she held it suggested this was the kill shot. But here's my favorite part, Senator Cruz. Last month, you issued a press release, I have it right here, condemning Washington elites who are out of touch with working families. That same day, you attended a private fundraiser in Manhattan where Wall Street executives paid $2,500 per plate to hear you promise to fight financial regulations. The average household income in Texas is $59,000 per year. Those executives made more betting against Texas families in a single afternoon than most of your constituents make in their entire lives. The silence in the room was deafening. Cruz looked like a man who had just realized he'd brought a water pistol to an artillery duel. His mouth opened and closed soundlessly, his theatrical confidence completely shattered by Warren's methodical presentation of irrefutable facts. Warren closed her folder with the quiet authority of someone who had just won a chess game in 12 moves. So when you talk about trusting the American people, Senator, which American people are you referring to? The working families in Texas who are struggling with predatory loans, or the Wall Street executives who write those loans and fund your campaigns? The question hung in the air like a sword of Damocles. Cruz had been completely, utterly, methodically destroyed, and everyone in that room knew it. The corporate lobbyists were frantically typing on their phones. Progressive activists were trying not to cheer out loud. Even the neutral reporters looked stunned by the thoroughness of Warren's preparation and the precision of her attack. Social media was exploding. Cable news shows were already cutting to the live feed. Political operatives across Washington were watching their phones light up with notifications as clips of the exchange went viral at light speed. But what came next would make CRUZ'S humiliation complete and turn Warren's methodical takedown into a legendary moment that would define both of their careers. CRUZ'S mouth moved for several seconds before any sound emerged, like a computer trying to boot up after a catastrophic system crash. When words finally came, they arrived as a stammering, incoherent mess that bore no resemblance to his usual polished rhetoric. That's not, the senator is mischaracterizing my record, these numbers are taken out of context. His voice trailed off as he seemed to realize that every word was digging his grave deeper. The confident smirk had been replaced by the wide-eyed panic of a man watching his career implode in real time. The other senators sat frozen in stunned silence, their faces reflecting a mixture of awe and terror. Republican Senator John Cornyn looked like he wanted to crawl under the table and hide. Democratic senators were clearly struggling not to break into applause. Even the committee chair seemed momentarily speechless, unsure how to proceed after witnessing such a complete political annihilation. The gallery erupted. Audible gasps rippled through the crowd like a wave, followed by barely suppressed murmurs and the frantic clicking of phones as everyone tried to capture and share what they'd just witnessed. Progressive activists in the front rows were gripping their seats so tightly their knuckles had turned white, their eyes shining with the kind of vindication they'd been waiting years to experience. But the real explosion was happening online, where the digital world was going absolutely insane. Within minutes, #WarrenDestroysCruz was trending nationwide, quickly joined by #CruzGotSchooled and #ReceiptsWarren. Twitter was a flood of fire emojis, shocked face gifs, and increasingly creative variations of Elizabeth Warren just ended Ted Cruz's whole career. The clip was spreading faster than a California wildfire. Facebook shares. Instagram stories. TikTok remixes. WhatsApp forwards to family group chats. The video was being compressed, edited, and shared across every platform simultaneously, each version adding new layers of commentary and reaction. Cable news shows interrupted their regular programming to replay the exchange. CNN's Wolf Blitzer called it one of the most devastating takedowns in Senate hearing history. MSNBC's Rachel Maddow was practically vibrating with excitement as she walked through Warren's methodical destruction point by point. Even Fox News couldn't ignore the story, though their hosts were scrambling to find ways to spin CRUZ'S humiliation as somehow victorious. Conservative pundits were in full damage control mode, but their efforts felt desperate and unconvincing. They tried claiming Warren's attack was unfair, that she had ambushed CRUZ with gotcha politics. But the facts were too clear, too well documented, too irrefutable. You can't spin getting caught red-handed, and CRUZ had been caught with his hands so deep in the corporate cookie jar that his arm was disappearing up to the elbow. Progressive voices were having a field day. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez tweeted a simple, books, 3-book emojis that somehow perfectly captured Warren's intellectual superiority. Bernie Sanders shared the clip with the caption, "This is what happens when preparation meets corruption." Even typically restrained Democratic leaders were celebrating Warren's methodical destruction of CRUZ'S credibility. The memes were instant and merciless. CRUZ'S shocked expression was photoshopped onto the surprised Pikachu template. Warren was portrayed as everything from a chess grandmaster to a prosecutor presenting evidence to a jury. Someone created a side-by-side comparison of CRUZ before and after Warren's attack, labeling it corporate confidence versus reality check. Real-time polling data started trickling in within hours, and the numbers were devastating for CRUZ. His approval ratings in Texas were dropping by the minute as clips of his stammering non-response played on loop across social media. Focus groups showed voters describing him as embarrassed, unprepared, and caught lying. The corporate money that had once seemed like political armor now looked like evidence of corruption. Corporate lobbyists were in full panic mode. Emergency meetings were being called in glass conference rooms across K Street. Damage control specialists who charged $1,000 an hour were suddenly booked solid. The banking industry's carefully crafted messaging about job-killing regulations had been exposed as the self-serving propaganda it always was, and they knew the political landscape had just shifted dramatically. Meanwhile, Warren's campaign coffers were exploding. Small dollar donations poured in from across the country as Americans who felt powerless against corporate greed finally saw someone fighting back with facts, preparation, and moral clarity. ActBlue servers were straining under the volume of contributions streaming in from supporters who wanted to reward someone for doing their homework and standing up to corporate corruption. The aftermath was clear. Elizabeth Warren had just demonstrated what happened when genuine expertise confronted empty performance, when methodical preparation met theatrical bluster, when someone who had spent decades studying corporate greed finally faced down someone who had spent decades profiting from it. But the full impact of Warren's systematic destruction of CRUZ'S was only beginning to unfold, and what came next would reshape how Americans thought about corporate power, political corruption, and the difference between serving constituents and serving donors. Warren let the silence stretch for one perfect moment, allowing CRUZ'S humiliation to settle into the marble columns and vaulted ceilings like dust after an earthquake. When she finally spoke again, her voice carried a different quality, not the prosecutorial precision of her methodical takedown, but the moral clarity of someone who had spent decades fighting for something bigger than political points. "You know what just happened here," she said, her eyes moving from CRUZ'S to the cameras to the gallery filled with ordinary Americans. "This is what happens when preparation meets performance. When someone who's done their homework faces someone who's just done their hair." A ripple of appreciation moved through the progressive activists, but Warren wasn't playing for applause. She was speaking to something deeper, something that transcended partisan politics and touched the fundamental question of what American democracy was supposed to be. For too long, we've accepted a system where sounding smart matters more than being right, where theatrical outrage substitutes for actual knowledge, where the loudest voice in the room gets to determine policy regardless of whether they understand the consequences. Her voice grew stronger, more passionate, building towards something that felt like a rallying cry. "Senator Cruz represents everything that's broken about our political system. He takes millions from corporations, votes exactly as they demand, then comes before the American people claiming to be their champion. He speaks in grand constitutional principles while ignoring the lived reality of families destroyed by the policies he champions. He performs populism while serving plutocracy." Warren's words were cutting through the political theater like a laser, exposing the ugly truth that most politicians spent their careers trying to hide. But she wasn't just tearing down, she was building something better. "But here's what I believe about America. We deserve better than politicians who treat expertise like a dirty word. We deserve representatives who do more than just memorize talking points, who actually study the issues, understand the consequences, and fight for policies based on evidence rather than ideology." The gallery was completely still, hanging on every word. Even the corporate lobbyists seemed transfixed, perhaps recognizing that they were hearing something they rarely encountered in Washington: authentic moral conviction backed by unshakable competence. "Democracy isn't a game show where the best performer wins," Warren continued, her voice rising with the kind of passion that could inspire movements. "It's a sacred trust between elected officials and the people they serve. When politicians take money from corporations and vote against their own constituents' interests, they're not just betraying that trust, they're betraying the very idea of representative government." She paused, letting her gaze sweep across the room one more time, encompassing CRUZ'S defeated posture, the stunned faces of her colleagues, and the citizens in the gallery who had witnessed something extraordinary. "I dream of an America where knowledge triumphs over ignorance, where representatives actually represent their constituents instead of their corporate donors, where doing your homework matters more than performing for the cameras." Her voice softened slightly, taking on an almost prophetic quality. "An America where a working family in Texas matters more than a Wall Street executive in Manhattan, where protecting consumers is more important than protecting corporate profits, where public service actually means serving the public." Warren closed her folder with quiet finality, the gesture symbolizing not just the end of her presentation but the completion of a larger mission. She had exposed the corruption, demonstrated the consequences, and offered a vision of something better. "That's the America I'm fighting for," she concluded, her words carrying the weight of decades spent in bankruptcy courts, academic research, and political battles against seemingly impossible odds. "An America where expertise matters, where preparation defeats bluster, where truth ultimately prevails over spin, and where democracy means government of the people, by the people, and for the people, not government of the corporations, by the lobbyists, and for the highest bidder. The silence that followed was different from the shocked quiet after CRUZ'S humiliation. This was the silence of recognition, of possibility, of hope that maybe, just maybe, American democracy could still be saved by people who cared enough to do their homework and fight for something bigger than themselves. The moment felt historic, transformative, like a turning point in the ongoing battle for the soul of American democracy. Remember that look on Ted Cruz's face when he realized what just happened. That wasn't just embarrassment, that was the exact moment when empty performance collided with brutal reality. When someone who had spent decades mastering the art of political theater discovered what happens when you bring talking points to a facts fight. Cruz walked into that hearing room thinking he was the smartest person there, armed with focus group-tested soundbites and corporate-approved rhetoric. He left as a cautionary tale about what happens when arrogance meets expertise, when performance confronts preparation, when someone who's done their homework faces someone who's just done their hair. This is what democracy looks like when it actually works. Not the manufactured outrage and theatrical grandstanding that dominates our news cycles, but the quiet power of knowledge confronting corruption, of truth cutting through spin like a sword through silk. Elizabeth Warren didn't need to raise her voice or pound the table, she just needed to open her folder and present the facts. In a functioning democracy, we need leaders who study the issues instead of just memorizing the talking points. Who understand the human consequences of their votes instead of just calculating the political benefits. Who fight for real families instead of corporate profits. Who serve their constituents instead of their donors. This is what happens when preparation meets performance, when substance confronts spectacle, when someone who actually cares about governing faces someone who only cares about performing. If you believe America deserves leaders who do their homework instead of just their hair, who serve the people instead of the powerful, then share this story. Subscribe to see more moments when truth cuts through the noise and expertise defeats empty rhetoric. Because in the end, facts don't care about your political theater. Preparation always beats performance. And sooner or later, the truth always wins, especially when it's delivered by someone who's done the work to earn the right to speak it. The look on Cruz's face proved it. Democracy demands better, and Elizabeth Warren delivered it.